Thank you all for joining us tonight at the Library of Congress. I'm Brent Iacobucci, the acting director of the Kluge Center. This program is sponsored by Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports the Library of Congress chairs in U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations. The chairs lead policy-relevant research, programming, and bipartisan legislative discussion on U.S. relations with China and Russia. The focus is on the present state of relations, as well as the public policy challenges likely to face legislators in the future. Mary Lovely is the Library of Congress Chair in U.S.-China relations. She is also the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and Professor of Economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she combines teaching and research on international trade and investment on the Chinese economy. Joining Mary tonight is Matthew Goodman. Matt is Senior Vice President for Economics and holds the Simon Chair in Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before joining CSIS, he served as Director for International Economics on the National Security Council staff and as Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the Department of State. He's also served in the White House and at the Albright-Stonebridge Group. Unfortunately, Peter Petrie couldn't join us. He got stuck on the tarmac and won't be able to join us. But we are glad to have you here tonight. We do hope you'll return. Before you leave, we'd encourage you to fill out our questionnaire. We use all of that feedback to maintain and improve the quality of these programs and find ways to serve you better. I would note that we are recording this and the discussion between our panelists, but once we move to your questions, the recording will stop and that discussion will be off the record. At that point, we'll have staff walking around with microphones so you can ask your questions. I look forward to a very interesting discussion, and thank you for joining us tonight. Mary?
Thank you, Brent. Thank you all for being here. Matt, you and I have been around the block a few times, and I think we're all learning. We're all students here. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is new, it's emerging, and tonight's discussion, we hope, brings up some of the things that we do know and highlight some of the areas where we really need to know more. Before we go, I'd just like to thank the staff of the Kluge Center and the Library of Congress for this fabulous dinner. So maybe we can give them a hand. Thank you, guys. Some people refer to the Biden administration's China policy as Trump light, but in my view, that is, not accurate. We see some similarities and we see some differences. The Biden administration has kept the China tariffs in place, although there's been quite a bit of conversation about how to reform those tariffs to better reflect U.S. strategic objectives. As yet, we have no idea what that will mean or what it will look like. But I think they have both shared a view that the American public needs a pause, needs to push the pause button on trade agreements for a while. And we're going to talk about that tonight and why IPEF is different from a trade agreement. There are differences, though, certainly in terms of how the two administrations relate to allies. I think that I remember when I used to fight with my brother, who was 5 years older and much stronger than me, we used to think that a good offense was the best defense, I came to realize, and in some cases it still is. I think that the Trump administration was often on the offense. I think we might think of the Biden administration in a different way, bringing the allies closer and almost using a good defense in case of future offense. And we'll see that also in IPEF. It's a deliberate initiative to become closer to the allies in Asia, Indo-Pacific, and to join together in a more formal way in the region, given our withdrawal from what was then the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The last difference is about China. I think we see the similarities. Both administrations view China as both a competitor. They also see the need to cooperate with China. And behind the headlines, there has continued to be cooperation with China on a number of areas. We see in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will not include China, the U.S., the projection of the U.S. image of China and fears about China. And so China is going to be very much part of the story, and I think hopefully it'll come up in some of your questions. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, just to throw a few facts out there. And then I'll turn to Matt for some questions, and Matt's been in the region recently, so we'll get some insights from his discussions with countries that are being asked to join in this initiative. And then we'll come back for general discussions and hopefully take questions from all of you. So let me just turn now to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. As we all know, it's a US-led initiative launched by the Biden administration just last month. The US has enlisted 13 countries to date, so that's 14 including the United States. Except for Fiji and India, all the others are already members of the China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And most economists look at what is called RCEP as a very important initiative in the region, even though we think of it as trade agreement light, mainly because it has very generous rules in terms of the accumulation of value throughout the region. So what are called rules of origin, and is meant to really begin to further solidify Asia as a production network. It's already a very formidable one, as you know. The founding IPEF members comprise 40% of world GDP, of which the US is clearly the largest contributor. The administration so far has released only an outline of what US objectives for the effort will be. We don't know yet what the negotiation agenda will be, but we do have some idea that we can discuss tonight. We know that market access, a reduction in US tariffs in exchange for reduction in tariffs by other members of the framework, is not explicitly on the table. But as we will probably discuss tonight, there's also some possible trade enhancing measures that can come from harmonization of digital standards, increased cross-border investment, and other types of non-specifically trade barrier features of the initiative. There are 4 pillars to the IPEF, and countries can choose to join 1, 2, 3, or 4 as far as we know so far. However, once a pillar is established, I believe it's the case that countries will have to take that pillar all or nothing. So it is a little bit of an a la carte method, menu, but once you join a pillar, you're in for the whole shebang. The pillars are connected economy, and this is the main trade focus. It is going to engage the region on a wide range of issues, and I'm going to here present it the way the administration would have it presented, and we can deconstruct and problematize it during Q&A if we like. So this will include rules for the digital economy, addressing issues of ethical use of AI, increasing the strength of labor and environmental standards, and corporate accountability, among other things. So connected economy. The second is resilient economy. This includes, among other things, mapping, tracing, monitoring, and diversifying supply chains. And clearly that resonates with all of us who've just been through the COVID-19 experience. The third is clean economy. This is trying to make commitments to development of clean energy, decarbonization, and providing methods, pathways for funding of new infrastructure. The last is a fair economy. This will include negotiation of effective enforcement of trade rules for mobile capital in particular, anti-money laundering, anti-corruption. So those are the 4 pillars: connected economy, resilient economy, clean economy, fair economy. Now there are some unique features of this framework that we haven't seen before. It's not a typical trade agreement, even though many people refer to it as a trade agreement. This is really no discussion of reducing tariffs. The trade component is really about harmonizing rules and, in fact, raising the hurdle for participating in trade. It's meant to be about creating a race to the top, whatever that means, and we can talk about that. So instead of lowering import taxes, which is what a tariff is. It's about raising the hurdle for participating in trading with the United States. This appears, it's not a single undertaking like the World Trade Organization. Countries are able to sign on to individual pillars, and they can leave other parts aside if they don't feel like they're at a level of development that they're ready to take on those commitments. There's no dispute settlement and no enforcement mechanism within a framework. Enforcement would be based on each country's own set of administered protection, so anti-dumping or countervailing duties in the US case, among others. Matt will talk a little bit more about features of IPEF and whether or not they're attractive to partners, or which are, which aren't. So I'll turn to Matt in a minute for that. So these are all what we might think of as good goals. But we also have to see the IPEF in a bit of a darker side, the other side of the coin, I think, which is that it is a response to China and China's increasing role in the region. The successful completion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was originally ASEAN-led, but then China certainly, and the US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership puts the US at a disadvantage in shaping and deepening economic relations in the region. IPEF is in some sense a response to that. It's an effort to build a new type of architecture in the region, and I think it's also explicitly an attempt to build China out. So let me just provide some ways I think it's an effort to build China out. One, it will do it by creating a set of standards that function in ways that exclude China from commercial engagement based on them. These standards might be technical standards for how 6G is going to work, might be labor standards, environmental standards, human rights. The second way to build China out would be by preparing for new technology introduction among the member countries, by deepening cooperation and supply relationships in ways that exclude China. The third is by establishing a separate set of what the administration calls rules of the road for trade that enable members to compete fairly. Now, this clearly refers to labor standards, human rights, and we know already that the U.S. has some major problems with China in those ways. Enhancing resilience by reducing overdependence, and when we say reducing overdependence, we mean too much dependence on China. And lastly, the IPEF promises to map and monitor supply networks. So it's really a way to see how reliant we are on China. And that's actually something we don't know, because oftentimes firms don't know their second, third, or fourth tier suppliers. And we find out that there is a critical element that comes from one country that holds up everything. We didn't know it existed. I have to say that has really changed. Corporations are looking beyond second tier to third tier and fourth tier now. They have that message. They're well into that. But I think that this mapping and monitoring of supply networks has a very important role, which is to make sure we don't get caught short in the next pandemic, but also as a way to reduce our dependence on China. I just want to highlight a little bit of what the U.S. is up against in pursuing the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. First, I can say, and we can talk about, Matt certainly can talk about, in several points in the documents, the Biden administration argues that India would be the center for this, but we already know India is a very hard player. We saw today basically the gutting of the fisheries agreement in the WTO, which was meant to control subsidies for fishing and reduce illegal fishing. And the only way to get an agreement was to basically take out anything that referred to subsidies. So we have an agreement on subsidies leaving overfishing that does not really contain subsidies. Okay. So India is a tough partner for this. The second is just that China is a formidable competitor. Foreign investment flows to China remain very high. Now, I'm not talking about 2022. 2022 and the lockdowns could be a turning point, and we can come back and talk about that. But in 2021, foreign direct investment flows into China reached an all-time high, which might be news to some people given the bad press that we hear. It is shifting toward services, so flows are moving away from manufacturing into services, and that's fueled by China's relaxation on ownership restrictions that required investors, say from the United States, to enter into services only by forming joint ventures. Part of what the US has asked for repeatedly over the last 20 years is for China to relax those ownership restrictions. Now that it has, we see this inflow of investment. China has been losing little ground in global manufacturing export shares despite the massive tariffs that we placed on Chinese exports to the United States. Its share of world manufacturing exports in 2015 was just about 18%. In 2019, it's 17.6%. So it's gone down a very tiny bit. And most of that was picked up by ASEAN countries and a little bit by Mexico. So on trade and investment flows, we haven't done a very good job of diminishing the world appetite for investing and trading with China. When we look at two of our key allies that are parts of IPEF, Japan and South Korea, we see they have very important markets and manufacturing interests in China. Take Japan. China takes a fifth of its exports. About a fifth of its imports from China are processing trade. That means that it's importing from China specifically as inputs into its manufacturing process. About a fifth of its imports from China are from foreign invested enterprises, many of whom are the subsidiaries of its multinational firms. So China is, in some sense, its backyard. It's where a lot of its manufacturing gets done, and it's how Japan stays competitive. Pulling Japan away from that orbit is going to be very difficult if that's what we intend. South Korea, very similar, only even deeper integration. China takes about 1/3. So Japan, 1/5, South Korea, 1/3 of its exports. Its processing imports, about 40%. Again, this reflects processing trade is where you send inputs to be further processed and send back. So 40% of South Korean imports from China are processing. Again, heavily involved, trade is heavily mediated by foreign invested enterprises, which are mainly the foreign affiliates of Korean multinationals. When we look at the regional comprehensive partnership countries as a whole, almost half of the bloc's trade is within the bloc itself. So Asia has got a pretty good thing going, and the thing it has going has China firmly in the center. Now, people will say to me, but isn't manufacturing moving away from China? And the answer is yes. What's moving away from China is labor-intensive activities. And I've got here a chart looking at world apparel and footwear as sort of a proxy for labor-intensive goods. And China has decreased its global share of exports of those goods from almost 38% in 2015 to about 30% today. But the rest of it has really been picked up by other parts of Asia. So it has been moving away from these goods. What has it doing in response, given that its share of global exports has stayed the same, or in fact has increased? And the answer is it's moved up into what we might call medium skill and technology intensive industries. So China continues to advance and move up what we call the chain of comparative advantage. So I'm going to leave that as an opening, tell you a little bit about what IPEF is, and also what's already in the region and some of the difficulties that the US will face. So we might think of them as the economic realities on the ground in terms of launching IPEF. Matt, I want to turn to you now. I hope you know. Your recent research and writing on how the US can bolster support for IPEF on the region is very illuminating. Based on your interviews and your observations, can you provide some insight into how the countries think about IPEF? I mean, we might ask, why did these 13 countries, now including Fiji, why did they agree to sign on to the IPEF launch?
Well, thanks, Mary. First, let me thank the Kluge Center also for this opportunity. It's great meal and great opportunity to chat with all of you. And we really, I think Mary would agree, want to hear from all of you what you're interested in, rather than just us, yapping at you. So tell us what you want to hear about this. I know many of you are already tracking some of this stuff, so we don't want to bore you with stuff you already understand. But I mean, in answer to that question, I would say there is a very strong demand signal in the Indo-Pacific region, basically this region from India to Fiji, for U.S. engagement in that region. You know, the U.S. is not an Asian country, but we are a Pacific power, and our power, our military power, is broadly welcome there because we've provided and provide stability and peace and broad security. They don't like everything we do in that regard, but I think broadly speaking, we're welcome as a military power in the region. But that is, if that's all it is, that's uncomfortable for a lot of countries in the region, and they want the U.S. to be engaged on other domains. So they want us there as a diplomatic power, as a cultural power, and definitely as an economic power. And so I think that's the basic answer as to why countries wanted to be part of this at the beginning. I think a little deeper into that, I think there were. Well, let me first say on the economic stuff, what they really want from us at the end of the day is our market. I mean, I know this is going to get into some controversial dimensions of this story and of the trade policy conversation, but analytically, I would say what these countries want from us is our market, because we're all wealthy people in the scheme of things, and we buy a lot of stuff from that region, and folks want to sell more of it to us. So that's, at the end of the day, what they really want from us economically, and to some extent they want our money, but they don't want $1 trillion the way China's saying they're going to spend $1 trillion on Belt and Road initiatives and so forth, which we're not sure they're going to spend that kind of money anyway. But even if they do, that's not the win. As I said in this recent piece, it's not the way to win hearts and minds. There's targeted money, and we can come back to exactly how that's used in a smart way. But it's really not even about that. I think it really is, at the end of the day, about our being there and showing that we care and want to be part of regional economic affairs, and also, frankly, our market. And then one more sort of specific, sort of more practical answer to the question is, about 2 weeks before May 23rd, when this initiative was launched in Tokyo, when President Biden was there, if you had asked me how many countries are going to join this thing, I would have said 4 or 5, the kind of usual suspects: Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. And then anybody else? Maybe not. And part of that is because the administration had set a very high bar for joining this thing. Basically, you had to sign a kind of a Declaration of Independence or Constitution that said, we the people of the region agree to all these objectives and principles and standards. And I think that made countries uncomfortable before, as the sort of price of entry to have to agree to all this stuff. It's not that they disagreed with it all, but they wanted to, talk about it before signing on. So I think the administration eventually decided it was more important to have a lot of countries in, and so they kind of lowered the bar and said, just come to this opening. Here's the broad plan, but we'll talk about it, and we'll sort of roll up our sleeves and figure out exactly what it means from there. So I think that's and very specifically, India was the most uncertain or most unlikely participant, since you raised them. Why India? I think in addition to all of that, Prime Minister Modi was in Tokyo with President Biden, and I think it would have been awkward for him to say, oh, never mind, I don't want to be part of this. Everybody else can join, but I don't want to. So I think that was a final factor in all this.
So Matt, you've already mentioned that the administration had to kind of water down this initial, this is just the toe in the water phase, right? Do you think that when the U.S. starts asking for firm commitments, higher standards, and on labor, environmental, that countries will just jump ship? They're free to choose 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 pillars?
Yeah, I think that is a concern, or that they participate but are sort of disruptive rather than constructive. And they're sort of, as you mentioned, not to pick on any countries, but I won't use their name, but I'll just say their initials are India, has been disruptive in other trade matters, and so there's a concern that they might, sort of try and slow walk any of this work. Now, the good news is I've heard even today I got another confirmation from somebody who's knowledgeable about the debate or the discussion in this group that it seems like most of those 14 countries are going to join probably all of the groups. I know that's maybe newsworthy, but because most people think that they're going to drop out. But what I'm hearing is that when what I understand is going to happen in sometime in mid-July, there's going to be a meeting of senior officials, meaning in the U.S. system, that's basically Sharon Yuan at the Commerce Department and Dawn Shackelford at USTR and their peers, plus the designated senior officials for each of the 4 pillars. They're all going to meet, and then they're going to decide on what the ministers are going to announce a couple of weeks later in late July. That's apparently the plan. And I guess if you think of that dynamic, if they're all there in one place meeting, it's awkward for any country to say, well, we're not going to join that group over there. So I can sort of understand that dynamic, that they're all going to at least show up to the first round, which is the good news, that everybody's going to be on board. The bad news is that then that means you're going to be in a room, with India and Indonesia and a lot of other countries that have a history of being difficult in some of these issues, and the U.S. has not clearly laid out exactly what they, well, I think there's a process issue again that I'm hearing that I think countries that are participating want to have more conversation at that kind of senior official level, the broad level, before they get into the pillars, the individual rooms. They kind of want to talk about the modalities of these negotiations and the broad sort of objectives and principles, because they want to sort of socialize that and get sort of familiar and comfortable and give their views. And it feels like the administration is trying to force them quickly into these different groups, and that could, I'm afraid, what I'm a little bit worried about is that could lead to a dynamic where countries say, well, if that's what you're going to push us to do, then we're not going to participate, or we're not going to be constructive on this. So we'll see. Maybe they'll fix that. I may be misinformed. I'm not in the room, but I'm a little bit concerned. Yes, that I don't think companies are going to in the short term drop out. That's awkward for them as well. But I do think they will. There's a possibility they're going to be disruptive.
Well, I mean, you have such diversity in the region in terms of size. India 1.3, almost 1.4 billion. Fiji 900,000. Yes, I did have to use Wikipedia today. Wealth, level of development, the degree of even we have non-democratic, size of state sector, all kinds of diversity. Do you think this will allow the U.S. to seize the high ground in setting norms in the region, particularly, say, on the digital economy, which many people are have the most hope for in terms of generating trade and commerce in the region with the United States?
Well, let me just start by saying, sort of trying to be constructive about all this. I do think that this is a good menu of issues. I think the topics that you mentioned, trade, including labor and environmental standards, and digital economy issues, and supply chains, and clean energy, anti-corruption and tax, all good topics to promote U.S. interests in the region. And I think from the partners' point of view, most of those issues are ones, again, when we did this study that you referred to, that we released in April on sort of regional perspectives, we heard broadly that these countries all welcome those topics and want to engage on some level on those things. So that's, again, the sort of the good news. It's a good array of topics, and they're ones that I think the U.S. does have a great stake in trying to advance, our preferred rules and norms in those areas, particularly digital. And I mean, if I strip it all away, I think that's where the stakes are highest. I mean, and because at the end of the day, this is a digitized conversation in part. Everything we do now in the global economy and public space more broadly, is digitized in some way. And, it really matters whether the way data flows in that world, the privacy standards, the security standards, the approach to those flows, we really want to have a say in that. Let's just put it, mildly, right? Because there are a couple of other models out there there's China's model of sort of data protectionism, state control, surveillance. I don't think most people in this room would be comfortable living in a digital economy governed by that set of rules and norms. Then there's a European model that is a little bit more comfortable, but has some challenges. It starts with really that our personal data is or the protection of that is a human right, and I'm sure some people in this room may actually have sympathy for that perspective, as do I on some level, but that's the kind of organizing principle for then everything the Europeans do on sort of regulating this space or allowing the space to grow. And that is not entirely comfortable for us Americans, right? Our problem is we have impulses on this stuff. I think we all kind of broadly know that we want sort of stuff to be free and flowing and the data to move around. And we sort of know that we want some kind of privacy, both from the government and from Mark Zuckerberg. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I do.
And Elon Musk, I guess. And we we broadly want the stuff to be secure, right? But and you guys can talk about this more than I can. But as you know, we're not quite sure what we want to do about legislation or regulation of all of that. And so we have sort of impulses, but we don't yet have a model to offer the world. That's a problem in itself. I think we need to have a federal privacy law. There, I said it. I think if we're going to play in this game, but then we need to be out there advocating for this. So I think that is probably of all the issues, that's the most important. And I didn't actually answer your question, which is I think it's possible through this IPEF that we can advance our preferred norms. I do think in the Asia region, there's a tested model, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which most people kind of belittle and everything. I'm one of the 5 people in town who actually thinks APEC is a powerful tool of U.S. statecraft because it is kind of soft rulemaking and norm setting without forcing people to agree to binding rules, and it's helpful and it creates synapses among policymakers and regulators. If that's it, we could over time constructively advance our perspective if that's what IPEF is going to look like. But then it begs the question of why not just use APEC? Okay, China's in there, so that's, and Russia. So that's that's one answer to that question. But I think that's possible. But I'm not sure it's sufficient for us to win the day. We have to do some other things.
Well, clearly we need to better define what we see as the rules of the road that we're trying to sell to the rest of the world. My forays into the region say that yes, there is a hunger, there is a desire for the U.S. to be present, in some sense as a bulwark against China. Not no one wants to pick. Yes, I want to be in this market and not in that market, but there's also fear of China, and that certainly has been heightened by its weaponization of trade in Australia, Lithuania. And so, we see this active desire for the U.S. to be present. On the other hand, as you're talking about APEC, it's this sort of, let's all coordinate, but we're not going to get too hard and fast about what you owe me or I owe you or how we're going to settle our disagreements. That seems to be the model in IPEF, except that the U.S. is talking about enforcement pretty seriously. And that leads me to two things. One is enforcement in this case means you will do it the way you say you're going to do it, or your access to the U.S. market will be denied. And that, I think, people look at what happened with China, and they see that the U.S. can do that in a way that was, in some sense, shocking for the rest of the world. And also, in some sense, our abandonment of the dispute settlement within the WTO. I mean, that's a U.S. creation, right? So we throw our baby out in some sense. So that's one thing. Is this really an effort that is backed by not carrots, but sticks that could be coming down? I think some of our allies actually realize that, and they're seeing the U.S. and Europe. We haven't talked about Europe yet, Matt, but Europe is in here. It's featured in various places in the framework itself, but also I think other nations see the U.S. and Europe making arrangements through the Trade and Technology Council, which a lot of us may say, well, it has had some impact. People credit it with allowing the US and Europe to coordinate so rapidly in terms of sanctions against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. However, there are features of that I think in Asia are scary, like the green steel. Will the US and Europe create a mini market that will disadvantage us? So isn't there this darker element there in terms of creating a market? You may call it a race to the top, but it really goes against the long-standing principles of the United States that were, embodied in the WTO: reciprocity, non-discrimination, the idea that one can, seek development through trade. How do you think about that? Is Europe in here?
Boy, there's a lot in there to unpack. But I would say, first of all, I do think it's one of the questions, let's call it not flaws, but questions about this arrangement. If we're going to focus on, that sort of unilateral enforcement, which implies that we're seeking binding commitments from other countries that we're then going to hold them to, that raises a bunch of questions like, okay, maybe, but then what are we offering, those countries as a positive incentive? And so I think you're right that that sort of approach feels more like a stick-led approach. I mean, I do think there's kind of, in talking to a congressional audience, I'd say, one challenge for an administration. I'm wearing my congressional tie, my constitutional tie today. It has the Constitution on it, so I'm very conscious that you guys are in charge of some things, and the administration, the executive, is in charge of other things. Basically, it's a little oversimplified, but you control the carrots, and the executive branch controls the sticks, or they don't have a lot of options carrot-wise unless your bosses give them the carrots, that meaning like market access or money or other things that you're uniquely positioned to offer. So I do think that missing element in IPEF, if we're not going to ask for congressional authority to negotiate this or approval of whatever's achieved, is a question I have about how we're approaching this, because I think from the perspective of the other countries, they're going to say, so you're not really offering me much, maybe. I mean, we'll see, and I don't mean to totally dismiss some of the incentives that might be part of this. There could be some interesting things in there, possibly, on supply chains or clean energy or infrastructure or other things, which we can talk about. But overall, you're not really offering, the kind of traditional things. But you're expecting us to make binding commitments to these high standards that for some things are difficult for us, and then you're going to punish us if we don't live up to those. That doesn't feel like a great deal, maybe, for a lot of these countries. I'm not, I don't work for those countries. I work for the United States. I want us to win, but I only talk about that because if we're going to persuade people, to do the things the way we want them done, I think we have to be willing to offer them, carrots, and then, sure, some sticks if they're appropriately governed. And it gets to your WTO question. I mean, we do want to do that in a way that's consistent with, the international rules-based system, I think. It's not working well, I admit, but there is some value to maintaining that kind of broad discipline, because others are subject to it, and if we don't subject ourselves to it, then others are going to for sure violate it. So that's a concern as well in taking unilateral actions under this. So
I would argue we've already seen that. So there's lots of questions about whether we're going to, are traditional free trade areas dead? What's the role of China?